We're waiting for Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland to wrap her meeting with the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. She's in Washington talking with them about ways to repair the fraying trade relationship between Canada and the United States and get the NAFTA renegotiations back on track. And the CBC's Evan Dyer is on the story. And so, Evan, it's certainly significant for her to be meeting with this Foreign Relations Committee. I also found it interesting that we heard from Jeff Flake not too long ago, a senator on that committee, basically repeating what Justin Trudeau said about using national security as a reason to impose tariffs on steel and aluminum, calling that insulting. So what is Freeland likely saying to the members?
I'm sure she's repeating exactly that same message, and probably getting a pretty receptive audience from some of them too. You know, this is a very influential committee. This is probably more important than any talks she has with the actual U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer in Washington, because the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, according to the Constitution, should have the power to say yay or nay to tariffs such as the ones that were imposed on Canadian aluminum and steel, and is indeed making a play through its chairman, Bob Corker, Republican of Tennessee, to recover those powers from President Trump, so that he won't be able to simply unilaterally and through executive order slap a 25% tariff on Canadian steel or a 10% tariff on Canadian aluminum. Now, Bob Corker, of course, is running into a problem with some of the members of his own caucus who are afraid to challenge Donald Trump because he has such strong support among the Republican Party base, and they face primary challenges. Jeff Flake is an exception. He's retiring, and he feels free now to criticize Donald Trump, but he's retiring because he knows he doesn't have a chance in the primary because he stood up to Donald Trump. Same situation with Bob Corker. This is his last term as a United States Senator. But these two and a few others on their sort of last days as a senator are making an effort to recover some of the traditional powers of the Senate, berating their colleagues who they accuse of being cowardly. Let's watch Senator Bob Corker doing exactly that yesterday on the Senate floor, telling his fellow Republican senators to back his bill.
I would bet that 95% of the people on this side of the aisle support intellectually this amendment. I would bet that. I would bet higher than 95%. And a lot of them would vote for it if it came to a vote. But no. Gosh, we might poke the bear. It's a language I've been hearing in the hallways. We might poke the bear. The president might get upset with us as United States senators if we vote on the Corker Amendment. So we're going to do everything we can to block it.
So that's the message. You know, remember that we're the party of free trade, or at least used to be. Let's grow a spine and stand up to President Donald Trump. And there are Republican senators who are listening to that.
And
Susan
Evan,
Collins.
sorry to interrupt you there, but let's listen to U.S. Senator Bob Corker following that meeting. He's speaking live in Washington.
The 232 national security section of our trade laws to counter their country. She talked about the backlash that is occurring there, but also about the great friendship we've had. I would just say, generally speaking, as a nation, we are fortunate to live in the neighborhood we live in. Very few countries have the benefit of having two neighbors that we get along with, but also a hemisphere full of people that we basically deal with in good stead. We have two countries that we have some issues with, Cuba and Venezuela, but generally speaking, we live in a very good neighborhood, and so I think there was a lot of concern expressed about the use of the national security 232 waiver. I have concerns about it. I think you know I've expressed them strongly. I do think it's an abuse of presidential authority to use the 232 waiver, and I've tried to pass a piece of legislation on the floor to counter that, to give us the ability, if he wants to continue to negotiate, but just bring the final product to the United States Senate, since in fact that is our Article 1 responsibility. So with that, she'll come out and speak, I'm sure. Most of us in the room shared the warmth that we have towards their country, and the fact that we hope that this soon will subside.
Senator, how do you convince the president that Canada is not a national security threat?
I'm not sure that at this juncture, I know that plenty of senators, I don't know of any senator that hasn't expressed concerns about what is happening and just sort of the random nature of what is happening. So again, I thought the best way to deal with that was through legislation.
Has the president damaged relations between Canada and the United States?
What's that?
Has the president damaged relations between Canada and the U.S.?
Well, I don't think there's any question that that has occurred. I mean, you'd have to be not paying attention to know that we've damaged relations. The question is that going to be towards a good benefit? Sometimes, and I think the jury's out on that. Hopefully, again, cooler heads will prevail. Canada's not a country that we have trade issues with. Each country has minor things. I know right now we've tariffed their lumber. I've got contractors throughout our state of Tennessee and other places that are concerned about the tariffs that we put on them. I think the American people sometimes don't fully realize, I think many of them do, that a tariff is a tax on us. A tax on us. It's a unilateral tax on the American people.
Senator, are you looking at ways that you can work with Canada to try and lobby the president or try to lobby the Trump administration? Did you talk about a possible strategy?
I don't think we're in that mode. I don't think, look, there are plenty of senators, me directly. I don't know of any senator that I know of on the Republican side that has not expressed concerns to the president, both about using 232, but also just the random nature of how this is all being carried out. And so I don't think talking is...
What advice would you give to the Canadians? What advice do you give to them? What do you say to Christian feelings?
Look, the Canadians are not going to escalate, but they're going to have to retaliate. And I think that, and by the way, I'm just saying what they're saying. I'm not encouraging or discouraging, but obviously when a country has something done to them as it relates outside of the norms, we have disputes. This is the one thing about 232 that I would like to, I'm not sure everybody fully understands why I've been so concerned about using 232. If you use the other sections of our Trade Act, there's a process that you go through with the other country to resolve it. Under 232, there is no process. The president just wakes up one day and decides that he's going to tariff a country, and there's not a process, a resolution process to deal with that. So the other country, the only way they can counter that is to retaliate in their own form. And so I think you'll see that happening in Europe. You'll see that happening with Canada and Mexico.
On CTE, Senator.
How would you go with your Republican colleagues today after your floor speech yesterday and now the story this morning, the call by Congress that you made earlier?
Yeah.
Were they receptive to the exhibit? Were they not happy?
Yeah. We had a very good conversation at lunch.
On CTE, you and other people, as recently as yesterday, had thought the administration was going to simply allow that measure to stay in the NDAA. Today, a White House official said the White House would oppose it and try to change it. Do you see things changing? Where do things stand?
I think, I had understood from some of the senators involved, and I may have a misunderstanding, I don't think so, that there had been a wink and a nod saying, look, we did what we did with the leader of China, but if Congress wants to counter that, they're free to do so. Now there must be some pushback occurring from China, where all of a sudden, if in fact that was the appropriate understanding, I think it was, then I think the administration must be getting some pushback now from China. So. Okay. Come on, Menendez.
What is the likelihood of your amendment going forward at this point?
Well, the amendment's not going to happen on NDAA. I think we know that. I'm not the type of person to want to block my colleagues from having amendment votes. We're having some of those right now. But I am looking to have a vote and take action, and so we're beginning to think of other ways. I find it an abuse of authorities, and I think that just from the standpoint of the Senate being the Senate, that we ought to have a vote on the final products if it's going to be abused in this manner. With that, let me bring Senator Menendez up here.
Is two-part bargaining chip in the NAFTA talks?
Let me just very briefly, as the senior Democrat on the Foreign Relations Committee, tell you what I shared with the Foreign Minister of Canada, that from a Democratic perspective, we deeply cherish the relationship we have with Canada. We think it is one of the most important national security and national interest alliances that we have. We cherish that the sons and daughters of Canada have fought alongside the sons and daughters of America, and many of them have lost their lives abroad in pursuit of peace and stability and democracy, as well as combating international terrorism. We may have disputes economically, but there are ways to deal with that. And certainly we do not believe that Canadian steel and aluminum is a national security threat to the United States of America. And so we have a very different view, and we wanted to express to the foreign minister as she returns to Canada that hopefully she will share with Canadians that the view of the president is not the view of all of the American people, and by far not the view of, I believe, a majority in the United States Senate.
Senator, how has the president affected Canada-U.S. relations?
Well, clearly every action has a reaction. That's just the reality. And I asked the foreign minister, what about our engagement as we deal with China's unfair trade practices? Has this affected it? How about our continuing efforts to make sure that Russia is sanctioned for violating the international order in Crimea and eastern Ukraine, as well as what it's doing elsewhere in the world? What will it mean for NAFTA negotiations? And I think that the answers to some of those questions was that Canada, and for that fact, our European allies still continue to hold the view that Russia cannot return to the G7 for so long as it continues to occupy Crimea and continues to have irregular forces in eastern Ukraine, that we are seeking a way forward on NAFTA, and that Canada has joined us in some of the actions through the regular trade processes as it relates to non-tariff trade barriers with reference to China. So this is a critically important ally to the United States, and you don't give your back of the hand to some of your closest allies. You can have a dispute, but there is a way to find a process forward.
Are the tariffs being used as a bargaining chip in the NAFTA talks?
You'd have to ask the administration that, but look, when you invoke 232, it's not only about tariffs. You impugn Canadians in a way that suggests that they are a national security threat to the United States. This is the longest, most peaceful border in the world between two countries. And I think that what I heard the foreign minister say, I'll let her speak for herself, but it's that Canadians were deeply hurt, not necessarily by the tariffs in and of themselves, although that's a challenge, but deeply hurt that America, its closest ally, would suggest that it is a national security threat. And I understand that. Thank you.
And those are U.S. senators that are coming to the mic after that meeting with the Foreign Affairs Minister, Chrystia Freeland, who we also expect to be approaching those microphones any moment now. And as soon as she does, we will let her speak. And here she is,
Bonjour
Chrystia
mes
Freeland.
amis, c'était un plaisir d'avoir l'opportunité de parler avec les membres du Comité des Affaires étrangères du Sénat américain. C'était un échange
It was a cordial and very direct exchange of views. We spoke obviously of all the actions under Section 232 concerning steel and aluminum, and we also discussed Russia and Venezuela and China and our NATO alliance.
It was a real pleasure for me to have this opportunity to meet with the members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. We had a wide-ranging discussion. Obviously, we spoke about the Section 232 steel and aluminum action. We also talked about Venezuela. We discussed Russia and Ukraine. We spoke about China. And I would like to say, point out maybe for the benefit especially of my American friends, that in our system, in addition to being a cabinet minister, and actually first and foremost, I too am a legislator. I'm a member of Parliament. I represent University Rosedale in Toronto. And so we in Canada really have a deep appreciation for and respect for America's legislative branch, American legislators, and it's always a pleasure for me to have the chance to speak to them directly. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer your questions.
How do you solve the actual dispute with the Trump administration? How do you do that?
Well, Canada, are you speaking about the Section 232 case? Canada has been very clear about that. The Section 232 action, which is, let me remind people, a national security consideration, is frankly absurd. The notion that Canadian steel and aluminum could pose a national security threat to the United States, I think Americans understand it's simply not the case. That action is also illegal under WTO and NAFTA rules, and we have raised cases in both tribunals. It might be worth pointing out as well that the United States, in fact, has a surplus in trade in steel with Canada. Canada has, therefore, truly, more in sorrow than in anger, announced a perfectly reciprocal, measured, dollar-for-dollar retaliation response. We have published our retaliatory list. Our tariffs will come into effect on July 1st. And it may also be worth mentioning that in this action, we are joined by our allies and the allies of the United States, the EU and Mexico. These are close allies of the United States, NATO allies, US neighbors, who, like Canada, have been illegally targeted by these Section 232 tariffs. The answer is very simple. The US has to remove these unfair, illegal tariffs from Canada and from its allies.
Do you feel you've marshaled a coalition here, within the U.S. of people in the Senate to really kind of help you, fight the Trump administration and get rid of these tariffs?
I think that it's important for the senators to speak for themselves. They are all very accomplished legislators, and I know they're very able to do that. What I will say is Canada, of all countries in the world, I think we probably have the closest, deepest, most multi-level relationship with the United States. We are, after all, the largest market for the United States, larger than China, Japan, and the UK combined. We share the world's longest undefended border, 9,000 kilometers. We're friends, we're neighbors, we're very often relatives, so we know each other very, very well. And Canadians know very well that there are many, many Americans who understand and deeply appreciate that friendship with Canada. And speaking for Canada, to all of those Americans, I'd like to say we really, really value our relationship with the United States. It's very important to us. And as the Prime Minister said when we announced our response to the Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs, we really are confident that at the end of the day, common sense will prevail.
Minister Freeland.
Minister, what are you hoping these senators do now that you've met them?
Again, it's not for me to speak for U.S. senators. This is a group of extremely accomplished, really admirable people, and they will do what they see fit. We in Canada do have a very strong appreciation of the authorities of the legislative branch, and so it's important to have a conversation with U.S. legislators, with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, to let them hear directly from us about what's happening.
Minister, did any of the senators offer any apologies on behalf of the behavior of the president, and did you accept those apologies?
Katie, again, I'm going to let the senators speak for themselves. This was a meeting that was in camera, and I'm going to respect that. What I will say to the senators is it was a very good conversation. I was very glad to hear directly from them their point of view. And I would like to say to Americans, I have heard directly from very many Americans, ranging from Americans who live in my own riding in Toronto, to people who have just written directly to me. I've heard from a lot of people saying, you know what, we just want to let you know personally, we really like Canada. We like the fact that you're our neighbors. We like working together. We like sharing this great continent. And to all those Americans, I want to say, we feel the same way. Thank you.
What was your reaction to the comments from the White House trade advisor saying there's a special person held for people like Justin Trudeau? And has Mr. Navarro called Canadians to apologize for those remarks?
Well, you know, my reaction was that speaking as Canada's foreign minister, the government of Canada does not believe that ad hominem attacks are the right way to go about foreign policy, to go about foreign relations, particularly when it comes to foreign relations with your close allies and neighbors. So that's our way of doing business, that's our way of conducting ourselves in the world, and that will continue to be our way of conducting ourselves in the world. And I do want to take this moment to thank every single member of Canada's Parliament. Our Parliament passed on Monday a resolution that had unanimous consent. Every single Canadian parliamentarian supported it, and this resolution supported Canada's action with the retaliatory tariffs and strongly supported our Prime Minister in the face of ad hominem attacks. So it's nice, it's very nice to be representing a united country. As for that, I think that's a question for Mr. Navarro.
Would you comment on the status of the NAFTA negotiations?
I had a good meeting with Ambassador Lighthizer on Friday in Charlevoix, and I'm grateful to Ambassador Lighthizer for making the trip. It was a constructive conversation. I spoke to Ambassador Lighthizer again on Sunday, and Ambassador Lighthizer and I, schedules permitting, are due to speak tomorrow, and I'm glad that we'll have that chance to talk. My
message was the same as the one I'm transmitting right now. My message was that Canada's viewpoint is that these tariffs on steel and aluminum are illegal and that they are unjustified. I explained the reasons behind our retaliation, and I also provided some facts on trade between Canada and the United States. And the senator thanked me for basing my arguments on facts. We also talked at length about the close collaboration between Canada and the United States concerning international issues, including the situation in Russia and Ukraine and in Venezuela, as well as our NATO partnership. And we discussed as well China.
So as I've said, when it comes to NAFTA, I had a good meeting with Ambassador Lighthizer on Friday. He came to Charlevoix, Quebec, and we had a chance to talk. I spoke with him again on Sunday, and schedules permitting, I am due to speak with him on Thursday. We believe that it's important for us to continue working on the NAFTA modernization effort. It's something that Canada has supported from the beginning. And, you know, in terms of the best approach to the NAFTA negotiation, the reality is that NAFTA today is a trilateral agreement, and that trilateral agreement has been in place for nearly a quarter century. It is also the case that we have been for now, I think it's 10 months working at this modernization. It's not unusual for trade negotiations to take some time. Trade agreements are complicated beasts, and we have been making some real progress in updating and modernizing this agreement. I think the prudent, the common sense approach is for us to continue that effort, and I'm looking forward to having that conversation with Ambassador Lighthizer tomorrow. I have also been in close touch, including this weekend, with Ildefonso Guajardo, my Mexican counterpart, the Mexican Minister of the Economy, and we have been discussing NAFTA as well. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
And that is Minister of Foreign Affairs Chrystia Freeland speaking to reporters after her meeting with the U.S. Foreign Relations Committee. We heard from American senators, whether they were Republican, Democrat, or the Minister of Foreign Affairs, more or less saying the same thing, that using national security as a reason to impose tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, in Chrystia Freeland's word, is absurd and illegal, according to WTO and NAFTA. But we also heard from some U.S. senators there. One, we heard from Bob Menendez saying, you don't give the back of a hand to your closest ally. Let's bring in the CBC's Evan Dyer, who's been following along from Ottawa with me. And interesting to see across party lines, and this in terms of the senators we heard from, across party lines and with Minister Freeland, they were more or less saying the same thing. And it was also interesting, don't you think, Evan, the way the minister directed her comments a couple of times at the American people and really emphasized that. And also at her respect for the legislative branch, for Congress.
That was important.
Maybe to really, you know what, let's work around the president.
Exactly. That, and she said a couple of times, she said, we in Canada have a deep respect for America's legislative branch. We in Canada appreciate the independence of the legislative branch. These legislators are accomplished people. They can speak for themselves, she said. And that's exactly what she's encouraging them to do, to speak for themselves and to push back and take back the power over tariffs, over sanctions. They've already taken it back, in fact, last year, to take back that authority from President Trump so that he cannot do what Bob Menendez just called an abuse of authority with these Section 232 tariffs. And you're absolutely right that both the Republican chair, Bob Corker, the Democratic vice chair, Bob Menendez, used Canadian talking points, basically, to describe these, with Bob Corker going so far as to saying the Canadians are going to have to retaliate, taking the side of Canada in this dispute, essentially against his own president. And this shows why it's so important for Canada, of course, to continue to go around the White House, to go to these other very important poles of power in the United States. And there's none more important than the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And you would have to say, listening to the senators talking, that it seems like Chrystia Freeland just, hit a home run in her presentation in there, because they're taking her side, in the case of Bob Corker, directly against his own president. All of that, though, still runs into the fact that there are fears among the Republicans in the Senate that they will face primary challenges from people who are not in favor of free trade, but from people who rather support the Trump agenda 100%. And that is the thing that's holding them back. That's why we've seen Bob Corker haranguing them as cowards, basically, and saying, come on, grow a spine. This is your legislative authority here. And I know that intellectually you support free trade, he says to them. I know you do. You're just afraid of Donald Trump. But they are afraid of Donald Trump, and they have reason to be afraid of Donald Trump, because 75% of Republican primary voters will vote for pretty much anyone who Donald Trump endorses, and that's whether they support free trade or not.
And so, that is clearly the Canadian strategy. That is what Chrystia Freeland is trying to accomplish here. And what did you make of, what some of the senators had to say about this national security and also the damaged relationship between Canada and the United States?
Well, it's you pointed out the back of the hand comment. I think we've heard a number of people making those remarks. I think I can't really think of anything else, actually, almost, that Donald Trump has done in terms of his dealings with other countries that has provoked such a strong and bipartisan backlash in the United States. And as an example of that, we saw Peter Navarro apologize. Have we seen any other Trump official apologize for something that he, I don't think we have.
It surprised me. The apology actually surprised me.
Well, when you consider that with this White House, the whole idea, they don't always seem to be terribly good at it, but their purpose at all times is to project an image of strength. And of course, the strong don't apologize. And that would certainly be Donald Trump's approach to things. And he himself, of course, has not apologized. He continues to talk about making the Canadian people pay a price for Justin Trudeau's speech saying that he would defend Canadian jobs and Canadian interests. So, but nonetheless, we have seen here pushback that we haven't seen before on the same level. The pushback is in Canada's favor. And it is just another indication of why that Team Canada approach is so important.
And just a final point, Evan, that you were mentioning earlier, that Chrystia Freeland is there for these meetings, but she's also there for a special event for her, and a special event that they've had to accommodate more people who want to attend.
That's right. Actually, you can see from the jostling of the cameras, you can tell I've been in that Senate area. We were there with Chrystia Freeland actually last October, and she was very well received. Then I've got to say, 36 senators showed up to listen to her and Justin Trudeau and a few others make presentation. Again tonight, she's going to be speaking at the Park Hyatt to receive an award from Foreign Policy magazine, which I think shows actually again that she is quite well respected. She's been very effective in Washington, and there's so many people now interested because of this controversy that's blown up between the U.S. and Canada that Foreign Policy had to send out a note today warning people to show up earlier than they had originally scheduled things, just to make sure that they can get everybody in. So she's down there making waves. There's no doubt about that. And her meetings of this kind, on Capitol Hill, in state houses, with industry, are every bit as important to the government of Canada as the ones that might happen with the White House or with Robert Lighthizer. And because of this broken relationship that we now have with the White House over the most recent insults, they've only become more important, and may at the end of the day maybe will be the thing that saves Canada from any further trouble.
These are fascinating and unusual times. Evan, thank you. That is the CBC's Evan Dyer live in Ottawa. Well, Ontario Premier Designate Doug Ford also spent the day focused on NAFTA and those new U.S. tariffs we've been talking about. Ford met with the province's auto and steel industry leaders, telling them thousands of jobs are at risk and the stakes are high. He also called U.S. President Trump's name-calling tweets unacceptable. The CBC's Megan Fitzpatrick is following that story, so tell us more about that, Megan.
Well, that's right, Andrew. He did meet with representatives from big companies like Stelco, based in Hamilton, Ontario, big motor companies like Ford, Toyota, and Honda. He said it was a productive conversation, and what he heard from the representatives was concern about the impact of those tariffs on the steel and aluminum industries and the threatened tariffs on the auto industry from President Trump. But he said he also heard a lot of confidence that the measures he intends to take once he takes office here at Queen's Park will help create a more competitive environment for businesses in Ontario. Ford said he will work tirelessly to protect the interests of workers in those sectors. Now, what that exactly means, we didn't get a lot of detail. The NDP, for example, which is set to become the official opposition here at Queen's Park, today was calling on Ford to work on setting up some kind of compensation package for workers who may be affected or whose jobs may be lost, loan guarantees for these companies, that kind of thing. Ford was asked if compensation was discussed with these representatives or if it's even a possibility or on the table, and he didn't directly answer that question, Andrew, but his team is saying today's meeting is the first of many. He's obviously still in the transition phase, having just won the election, and there'll be some details to be worked out, but he's saying that he will protect the interests of these workers, and he said he's also confident that the U.S. administration will realize that a trade war isn't good for workers on either side of the border. Here's more of what Ford said about that.
Nothing is beneficial from getting in an argument with each other. It just doesn't benefit companies, it doesn't benefit people, and it's going to hurt the United States with job losses as much as it's going to hurt Canadian job losses. When you go into a trade war, that's probably the worst thing for two great countries.
He really touted the strength of the U.S.-Canada relationship. He said he loves the United States of America. He does do business down there. His family business has an operation in Chicago. But again, he said he loves Canada. He will protect the workers here. But again, that the two countries should be able to get along, he said, and he's confident that the NAFTA renegotiations and these tariffs, that all of these issues will be resolved, Andrew.
And so, Megan, aren't these interesting times, right? You spend some time in Washington. You have American senators, Republican, Democrat, and the incoming premier, the progressive conservative premier, probably very different politically in many ways, Doug Ford, all expressing support for Justin Trudeau.
That's right. They are definitely not allies on certain policy issues. We know that. Mr. Ford and Mr. Trudeau, especially on the carbon tax. Ford is setting aside $30 million to take Trudeau to court over the carbon tax. But on this file, Ford is saying he is united with the federal government. He was asked to weigh in on those quite personal attacks from President Trump on Justin Trudeau in the last few days, and that's when Ford said that name-calling is unacceptable. During the campaign, we heard outgoing Premier Kathleen Wynne call U.S. President Donald Trump a bully. Ford was asked whether he would also characterize the U.S. president in that way or how he would describe his behavior with these tariffs, and here is his answer. Take a listen.
I'm not going to go down that road. I'm not going to go down that road and start, get into the name calling. This is a lot higher than name calling. This is about two great nations that live and work side by side. Families, some family members live in the U.S., some in Canada. We have the greatest relationship in the entire world, absolutely entire world, and we need to work together.
So he said working together and standing shoulder to shoulder with the federal government to fight against these tariffs, Andrew. And to that end, he will be meeting with some of his federal counterparts. Tomorrow, he will meet with Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland, as well as Canada's ambassador to the United States, David McNaughton. So Ford will be getting up to speed and getting briefed on these files, and obviously starting the process of how the province of Ontario, which largely depends on the steel industry and the auto industry, they're crucial here. Thousands and thousands of jobs in this province depend on those sectors, and it's a driver of the Canadian economy here. So as we heard Ford say this morning, there is a lot at stake, potential impact huge on the province of Ontario because of these tariffs. So they'll be sitting down tomorrow to talk about the path forward. Ford is not being sworn in as premier for another few weeks, but obviously as part of this transition process, his team is getting to work, so he's up to speed on these crucial issues that will face him once he does take over the province here.
All right, Megan, thank you. That is the CBC's Megan Fitzpatrick live in Toronto.